What I want to do as an introduction is to give you a little bit of a whirlwind overview of some of the arts and crafts treasures in our region. We're the only organization that really looks at design history in a non-academic and more public role in our community. So we're willing to stretch back a bit into the antecedents of the arts and crafts movement in the 19th century, and we're willing to, and actually eager, to engage contemporary craftspeople who are continuing at least some of the energy and creativity of the arts and crafts movement of the early 20th century. So we've done tours of the Joseph Lyman Silsby buildings here in Syracuse, and we've also gone to contemporary galleries like the Gandy Gallery down in Fabius, and we regularly visit the Everson Museum, where our friend Garth Johnson, who will be speaking later, not only informs us about the art pottery movement and the arts and crafts movement, ceramics of the early 20th century, but also about the work of many exciting contemporary craftspeople. But the movement itself, as most of you know, develops in England, and it influences American designers in the late 19th and early 20th century. The big influences in America are primarily John Ruskin and William Morris. Ruskin was a big influence on Silsby, as we'll see, and Morris was the primary influence on Gus Stickley around 1900. But we have other trends in design that come into Syracuse, and all of these trends meld, and many times we'll see works of art in many different media, or especially in architecture, which pick and choose. We have elements of the Gothic, elements of the Classicism and colonial, but sometimes mixed up with elements influenced by the arts and crafts movement. Ward Wellington Ward is a good example of that type of synthesis. We think of him as the ultimate, or as the most prolific and most creative arts and crafts architect in Syracuse, but he really drew from experience and his education at MIT, which exposed him to a wide range of architectural styles. So we look at arts and crafts broadly. In this little talk, I'm going to present to you just some highlights, but I want to do it somewhat geographically to give you a sense of the range that we have here, because certainly one of our goals as a society is to inform people that we were, and we continue to be a center of the arts and crafts movement. First, the making of the arts and crafts movement, and then the study and presentation of the arts and crafts movement in the last several decades. So we have a lot of resources here. Among these are collections. We have some splendid collections which are generally not so well known, even locally, and certainly not nationally and internationally. And I just want to run through a few of these. We'll start with, and they're alphabetical, and so that means that David Rudd's Dalton's American Decorative Arts comes first. But in many ways, it does come first because more than any other institution in the region, David, through his collection and study and sale and promotion of the work of Gustav Stickley and a whole range of other arts and crafts movement influenced artisans, has really educated and excited a population for decades about the arts and crafts movement. Remember, David and my generation, we came to the arts and crafts movement at a time when we were still inundated with modernism. And so the ethos of the arts and crafts movement, its emphasis on handcraft, on honesty and integration of materials, and a kind of holistic artistic vision was very appealing in the 1960s and 70s, and for many of us it's still appealing today. These things that are in David's shop up on James Street, of course, were rather inexpensive then. You could find them at lots of estate sales, and people just wanted to get rid of this big, heavy furniture. And of course now these pieces run in the tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. So those hippie collectors who were so excited about the arts and crafts movement in the 60s and 70s, sometimes our aspirations, our pocketbooks don't match our aspirations in continuing our love. But we can go to Dalton's and it's like a museum. And it's better than any museum, I was saying to David, that I've been to in the country. He said, I haven't been to the one in St. Petersburg. But the collection of objects there is so remarkable, and the quality is so remarkable. And of course, they're changing all the time because it is a commercial enterprise. So I urge everyone who comes to Syracuse, anyone who lives here, to make regular visits to Dalton's, even if you can't buy things, although some things are affordable for even the non-plutocrat. And it's a great place to go. David also has prints and books and other kinds of things there. So David's always been a leader, and he's taken this expertise nationally to conferences. He's written for Bungalow Magazine, many different aspects. And you can see his emphasis is primarily on Stickley, but he knows so much more, and he's going to talk to us a little bit later, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Next, alphabetically, is the Everson Museum of Art. The Everson began its role in the arts and crafts movement as early as 1916. They were the first to purchase Adelaide Alsop Robineau ceramics back in 1916 when they added 32 pieces to the collection. And recently, I think it was in 2023, Garth has done a new installation, a permanent installation of all the Robineau pieces down in the refurbished ceramics gallery. Now, the Everson has a lot of other stuff too, including Stickley and other arts and crafts pieces, but these are not usually on view. Some of you may recall the Robineau Gallery used to be all arts and crafts all the time. Now it's a changing exhibition space, but the museum does pull out its arts and crafts pieces for special exhibitions occasionally. But downstairs, the museum has totally been refurbished with new ceramics galleries, and these do include the range of ceramics covering a wide span of time and showcasing the remarkable collection and bringing in new collected materials. And Garth will talk about that, I'm sure, later, if not in his presentation. Some of us will be talking about these on the panel later. The Onondaga Historical Association is it's the attic of our region. It's a rich historical repository, and it's got remarkable collections, and it's adding collections all the time. For my purposes, the Ward Wellington Ward Drawing Collection is remarkable. Also, the Henry Keck Stained Glass Archive, exceptional. But they have historic costumes, and this is some pictures from a show of a few years ago that Jeffrey helped curate, I believe, with Barbara Rawlings, I think, was the other curator. And here are just some details of Keck stained glass window cartoons, which are there in the hundreds, maybe thousands, I think hundreds anyway. And these are enormous, the full size of windows. And there you see John Felleman, who's in the back, poring over some Ward Wellington Ward drawings in this exceptional collection. And there's an ongoing project to digitize these drawings, and I hope that will be completed in the near future. OHA is going through a massive renovation, and they will have new exhibition galleries, new archive space. They're renovating several floors of the building down on Montgomery Street, and when that's done, I think it will be a transformed institution. But the archive is always worth visiting and using and very welcoming. Then there's the Stickley Museum in Fayetteville, and Amanda Clifford will be speaking about that later. She's the director of the museum, and this is a company museum. It's owned and run by the Stickley company, Audi Stickley, but it's got one of the most, or because of that, it has one of the very best collection of Stickley furnishings, not just Gus, but all the brothers, and Amanda will talk about that later. It also covers their work beyond the arts and crafts period. So some of you may not like all of the more colonial influence, Cherry Valley type work, but others will love it. And it's always worth a visit, and we've been there as a organization, and we need to have a return visit soon. Then there's the Sue and Janae costume collection here at Syracuse University. It's part of the School of Design, which is part of the College of Visual Arts, Visual and Performing Arts. And Jeff Mayer is the curator. He's a professor of fashion here, has been since the early 90s. And they will soon have a permanent gallery and exhibition for these here at the university, but many of you may have seen some of these costumes loaned out for other exhibitions. And most spectacularly, back in 2013, for the big exhibition called American Look, Fashion, Decorative Arts, and Gustav Stickley, that was at the Everson. Dalton's Antiques, Dalton's Decorative Arts lent a lot of pieces for that show, I believe, and Jeffrey was either the curator or a co-curator. So we remember that, that great event. Unfortunately, after that event in 2013, a lot of arts and crafts materials that are in our community kind of went out of view. And what we're hoping is that renewed interest in different ways can bring back that, that visibility. Also here at the university, right in this building, are the special collections, the Syracuse SCRC, I forget what it stands for, I used to work there. Collections and Research Center, my old colleague Charles Tremper back there. Yes, most people don't know that I used to be the plastics curator here. Very different mindset, but it's about objects and materials and workmanship. But just a few of the examples are in the book collection are some works by William Morris, Kelmscott Press. This is the very first publication printed by Kelmscott Press back in 1891. And then we have this huge archive, this huge collection of Frederick Goudy, who was a marvelous type designer and printer. And you may have seen there was an exhibition here back in 2018, I think, or 19. And he was so influenced by Morris. So his first works were all emulating Morris and developing printed books and types. So here is actually publishing a work of Morris. He went on to do many other types of print design, and most of that's represented here in the collection. But we also have architectural drawings here at Syracuse University, and the Merton Granger drawings, for instance, are here. Granger worked with Ward and then became a prominent sort of Tudor revival architect here, arts and crafts architect here in Syracuse. And there are many other materials. So again, worth researching and visiting here. Okay, so beyond that, I want to look regionally. Syracuse isn't alone in this, and one can make this a center for a larger journey. Definitely Western New York already does this out of Aurora, and with the Roycroft Inn and places like that. It's a destination for people interested in the arts and crafts movement. So we can look at all the towns and cities that were prosperous here in the late 19th century that ring Syracuse, Ithaca, Auburn, Utica on the other side, all of which have rich offerings because this was the Silicon Valley of America in the late 19th century. This is where the tech giants were. This is where the economy was booming. But it was also something like funky Marin County, too, of the 60s and 70s at the same time. So all these alternative, wild, social, religious, philosophical, artistic visions could play out here. And there was this interchange, and one of the reasons we could have so much arts and crafts production, which William Morris sort of thought was going to be for the masses, he was soon realized that it was actually going to be for the elites, but because we had money here, we had elites here who could sponsor, who could afford a lot of the individualistic production. Bob Searing at OHA is thinking about this, writing about this, and we'll hear more from him, I think, on these themes going forward in the coming year. This is one of my favorite buildings. It's the Sage Chapel down in Ithaca, and I want to show it to you in particular because it's one of our few direct links with the arts and crafts movement of England. because they brought over a stone carver, Robert Richardson, to Ithaca to work on this building, and Richardson stayed. And basically he brought the traditional stone carving, stonemasonry skills from Europe and implanted them here in America. And the quality of his work is superb. He wasn't the only one who did this. American sponsors were bringing stonemasons from Italy to build churches. Even industrialists were bringing Italians, northern Italians, to Solvay. Solvay Process was staffed entirely by a whole village, essentially, from Italy that came over. But here we have a connection to this tradition of the late 19th century, just the period when Ruskin is dominant in his aesthetics and Morris is just beginning to come of age and to propose his ideas. But you can see stylistically this chapel draws on the Gothic, the English Gothic, the parish Gothic, made popular somewhat earlier by Pugin and the Oxford movement and others of that ilk. It's a mix of very simple forms and very lavish decorations. And we have here this apse that was added a little bit later in the late 1890s by the J.R. Lamb Studios of stupendous mosaics that are influenced by Byzantine and Italian 13th and 14th century Italian designs. Similarly, we have in Auburn, we have the Willard Chapel, and this was also from the 1890s, sponsored by the Willard family. And it's remarkable because the Tiffany Company of New York, which was the major decorative firm at the time, did many religious buildings, churches and synagogues actually. But this is one of the few that is entirely intact. So all the decoration and the design comes from Tiffany. And I don't know all the individual artists who worked on this, but I presume that somebody probably does. It's been researched. But we have a mix of mosaic, we have furniture, we have stained glass, and we have this remarkable gilded plaster relief on one of the walls. And here you see one of the stained glass chandeliers. Similarly, in Syracuse, we had movement in this direction. One of the best examples, to my mind, besides some of the great churches downtown, is the chapel in Oakwood Cemetery by the great architect Joseph Lyman Silsbee. Silsbee came from Boston, and he was trained, he was academically trained. He was the first architect to become successful in Syracuse who really had this new version of an architectural education. His predecessors, Horatio Nestle White, Archimedes Russell, all came up basically as apprentices and sort of learning as they went. But Silsbee had a more, what we'd almost call a modern architectural education. And he was very influenced by John Ruskin and the Stones of Venice. He did several buildings in Syracuse because he came as a replacement, as a substitute architect while Horatio Nelson White went away traveling. And then he stayed. He married one of the Sedgwicks, so became embedded in Syracuse society. But then as the progression of America moved west, he followed. He'd gone from Boston to Syracuse, but then he went on to Buffalo and then became one of the leading architects in Chicago. And in fact, Frank Lloyd Wright cut his teeth working in Silsbee's office. So Silsbee is a great name, and we have 4, even 5 of his surviving buildings here. He built more, but these are really to be cherished. 2 of them are well known downtown, the Syracuse Savings Bank and the White Memorial Building. And the White Memorial Building especially kind of reflects this Ruskinian Gothic, as it came to be called. It's a polychromy, brick and limestone, and uses Gothic ornaments, but very flat decoration and other kinds of elements, which actually some of which will transfer into the next phase of the arts and crafts movement. So before Silsbee, a lot of the architecture was mostly referential to older styles. Horatio Nelson White loved Gothic and French Empire. So all of you know the Hall of Languages, which was the College of Liberal Arts just up the hill here. Didn't originally have that center tower, and this was totally refurbished in the 70s, but only after it was put on the National Register of Historic Places. And in the 1970s, that's when the historic preservation movement kicks off here in Syracuse, and we begin looking at a lot of the important buildings of the past and trying to save them. This is the exact same moment when scores of buildings are also being torn down for I-81, for clearance of much of the eastern part of downtown Syracuse. Some were saved, some were refurbished, and the Hall of Languages had a rather, had a very contemporary, and I think looking back, maybe not such a successful renovation in the 70s to make it usable. That was the style of the time, but more recently, Krause College, which was the women's college, was lovingly restored in the early 2000s so that all of its original features were protected and preserved: the woodwork, the stonework, and the stained glass. This is just a detail. Recently, many of you are aware that there was a controversy at the university over this house, obviously not an arts and crafts movement house, a colonial revival house, 727 Comstock. It was designed by the firm of Gagin & Gagin, who did a lot of the university buildings at that time, and it was designed for the Estabrook couple, Charles and I think Laura was his wife, and they, he was an up-and-coming lawyer. The firm still exists, but importantly, he became a patron of the arts and crafts movement in Syracuse, and particularly a patron of the architect Ward Wellington Ward. He was the lawyer of the Moyers, Moyer Carriage Company. The daughter of that company married, Maud married Ward Wellington Ward, and he moved to Syracuse in 1908, and immediately Estabrook and the Moyers became his primary patrons and helped introduce him to the wider community. So a lot of activity took place in this house that impacted the artistic and architectural future of Syracuse during those key decades between 1908 and about the mid-20s, when the Estabrooks moved out to Fayetteville, to what was known as the Wellington House, which we'll get to in a minute. A few years after they built their own colonial revival house, the Estabrooks commissioned Ward, he'd just been in Syracuse for a year, was still a very young man, to design a house for for Charles Estabrook's step parents. And that's this house here, known as the Theron House, just a block away on 819 Comstock. It's still there, and it needs to be protected, be sure that it's protected. We are apprehensive because a house at 813, almost next door, this very attractive house was purchased and demolished by the university just a few years ago. And there's just an empty lot now there. We don't know what the plans are. So all of these buildings can be used, but they're all threatened too, because they are often on big lots, and you can do a lot of things on these lots if zoning allows. The most amazing threat was to the Estabrook estate, which was where the Estabrooks moved in 1923 out in Fayetteville. And this for years was known as the Wellington House, and was a great venue for events. But for various reasons, the longtime owner, who was a great participant in the Arts and Crafts Society, needed to sell. And the best offer he was getting was from a developer who would have torn down all of this complex and built some, like Panera or something like that, some chain stores. Fortunately, the community rallied to save this, and we were very involved in that process, but so was the county executive. And an angel came in with money and bought this, and has now been refurbishing it, restoring it, and it will be accessible to the public for different events in the future. And I'll talk to that in just a few minutes at the very end of my talk, because I'm going way too long. Okay. The Stickley House is the poster child for restoration of arts and crafts sites in Syracuse. This is a project that's been in the making since 1996, but really in the last 10 years it's taken off, and the interior restoration was completed in 2018, and the interior restoration will begin soon. You look at this and you say, well, this doesn't look like an arts and crafts house, and you're right. It's a kind of a simple Queen Anne version, and but the inside was totally redesigned by Gustav Stickley after a fire, Christmas fire in 1901. So the design is from 1902, the building's 1902, and it really becomes the first Craftsman interior. It's published in the Craftsman magazine, which Stickley is publishing from Syracuse at that time. And this is as it looks today, and it's just before interior restoration begins in the fall. David is the president of the Gustav Stickley House Foundation, and in some ways this spun off from the Arts and Crafts Society many years ago. The other luminary, and I know that Garth will be talking about Adelaide Alsop Robinow, is Robinow the toiler, and this is, here she is with the scarab bays, with the apotheosis of the toiler, and she and her husband Sam Robinow moved here in 1899, I think, might be off by a year, and they published Ceramics Studio, another important national craft magazine, and they soon built their house on what's Robinow Road on the west side. We've seen it from the Everson, but here's the house, and on the left is Robinow's studio. And these were designed built in 1904, designed by a very talented woman architect, Catherine Budd, who was a friend of Robinow. And these houses all survive, but they're private, and we don't have access to them right now. But there's some concern that there's deterioration on some of the buildings, so they need to be tended to and protected. But they are a resource, a very important resource to our community. Robinow Road was one of the early areas designated as a National Register Historic District in Syracuse. And since then, a number of areas with lots of arts and crafts movement inspired houses have been designated. Sedgwick is a local protected district. Berkeley Park is both local and National Register. Scottholm is a National Register district, and all of these have many houses influenced by Stickley, and others that are by Ward, Wellington Ward, and other architects of that generation, Howard Yates and Harry Phoenix, and other people who are less well known. But in the end, when it comes to arts and crafts movement, other than Robinow, it's Stickley and Ward, and then I do want to give a shout out to Irene Sargent, who was the intellectual force in the early years of the Craftsman magazine and the Craftsman movement. She was a professor at SU, and but we have nothing physical from her past except her grave, which is in Oakwood Cemetery. So I want to end very quickly just by giving you a range of the wealth of arts and crafts inspired houses. And as I say, many of them are eclectic, but these all are individualistic, they're unique, they're architect design. These are Ward Wellington Ward houses, some of the many, and there's some lectures I've given on Ward online if you need to know more. And Cleona Reed has recently updated the newest edition of this, her hand list of all the Ward buildings, and I know we've promised this to all of our members. We keep tweaking it, and it's going to go out to all of you soon, but it's also available for sale for $15. I think these newest ones are hot off the press. And then I want to end mostly with the newest National Register Historic District, which is coming before the State Review Board in December. This is the greater, the Westcott University National Register Historic District. It's huge. Some crazy person got an idea to put this forward and to research a lot of this history and these buildings. And sometimes crazy ideas actually, after many years, come to fruition. This district is not primarily an arts and crafts district. It is a working and middle class neighborhood it's the antidote to the garden suburbs of Berkeley Park and Scott Home. It's where people of more modest means lived, and there's a lot of kit houses and houses built, on spec by builders. They're all lovely by today's standards. They're 100 years old. I live in one of those houses built in 1920. But at the time they were a modest person's castle or country house because there's a little bit of lawn and they're not in a tenement downtown. But there are dozens and dozens, scores and scores actually, of houses that are more or less arts and crafts, directly, like this one, designed by Lamont Warner, who actually was working for Gustav Stickley at the time, and I think David may mention one of his sideboards or bookcases that he has. But a lot of them are just little bungalows or half bungalows that are inspired by the craftsman houses that are shown in Stickley's Craftsman magazine. So I'm not going to go through who designed all of these. Some of them we know. This is a Ward Wellington Ward in the lower left. That's Clarence Congdon in the center left. But you get the sense. And there are so many. And many of them remain, even though they're going to be in the district, they're essentially undocumented and unresearched. This, though, is the house of Cleota Reed, and this is the house that began it all, because moving into this house decades ago spurred Cleota's interest in Ward Wellington Ward, who designed it, and she began her quest to document all of his buildings everywhere, which is an ongoing process. And this is a house very similar to Cleota's that you can see on the left what it looked like about 10 years ago when it was covered by ugly yellow steel siding. But through the work of Norm Roth, who's here today, this house was very beautifully restored. It wasn't a complex job, but it was a job that took decades and decades and decades before anyone, before it got done. In the case of this house, and in so many, I believe, the original finishes are still to be found underneath the later steel and aluminum and vinyl siding. So there's still a lot to discover. This is one of the sore spot in the community, and I don't have an update on this. I meant to call the owner, Michael Huller, and I have not. But this is the Garrett House on the north side, and we did visit it and examined it not too long ago, and it is salvageable, and the owner would like to save it and is looking for ways to do that. It's a very expensive proposition. It's most famous for its St. George and the Dragon mosaic by Henry Mercer of the Moravian Pottery Works. Okay, and then lastly, back to the Wellington House or the Estabrook Estate. This is ongoing work. Jamie Williams might pop in later this afternoon. He was in New York last night. He's and Holmgren Qualquist are the architects who've been working on this project. Jamie has given a lecture about this for us in the past. This was saved, as I said, and it has Mercer tiles here, but in the new renovated kitchen, which is actually splendid, Holmgren Qualquist and the owner have commissioned Shenfield Tiles, a local firm who we have visited as well, who are now restoring all the tiles for the New York subway system, to come up with some new designs for the floors for these spaces that never had decoration, that are being totally refurbished. So I'll end with that.